Welcome to another edition of Shop Talk with George, a technical resource for Land Cruiser owners, techs, and shop owners. George is the proud owner of many Land Cruisers, including a very functional rock crawler shown here. He's been a regular fixture at off-road cruiser events for over 20 years. Here he is with the usual suspects at the Lone Star Roundup in West Texas a few years ago. George's favorite co-pilot is his son Garrett, now 9 years old, but wheeling since he was in diapers. George's day job is as owner of Valley Hybrids in Stockton, California, a dedicated Land Cruiser shop. The guy in the middle is his lead tech, Dominic Descent. The guy at left is a customer friend and wheeling buddy, but you'll hear more about him later. Valley Hybrids is a magical place where things happen to old Land Cruisers and new, everything from 40s to 200s. George won't sell or install anything that he hasn't tried out and doesn't believe in. The same thing goes for Dom. You got to pass muster to be considered for Valley Hybrids customers. George offers a complete selection of repair kits, parts, and accessories. If you need parts with good technical support from a recognized leader, you can visit the online store at cruiserbrothers.com or call toll-free to 800-224-7801. One area of need for older cruisers is their transfer case. If your TC is making noise, it may be time to consider a rebuild. This video provides a step-by-step how-to for the rebuild of a Land Cruiser transfer case. If you have a Land Cruiser, you also have a transfer case. With years and miles, these rigs need maintenance, so today we're going to rebuild a 60 series transfer case. TC rebuilds are usually the result of noisy operation due to worn bearings. This project is within the capabilities of an experienced home mechanic with simple hand tools. Our build rig is a 70 series owned by owner Esterer, a national expert on Land Cruisers based upon a long career as a Toyota parts manager and consultant. His firm, Land Cruiser Parts and Consulting, is a source for Toyota original equipment quality parts and accessories. Your transfer case is a secondary transmission that provides a second lower gear ratio for climbing and crawling. It also enables engagement of the front axle when four-wheel drive is required. The T-case is attached to the back of the transmission and has two sets of gears connected by an idler shaft in the middle. The T-case we rebuilt today was found in 60 series Land Cruisers and also some early 70 series. They're also popular for fitment in older Land Cruisers as an upgrade. There are two basic forms of the so-called split case transfer case. The early manual transmission model with a 34mm idler shaft, and the later 38mm idler shaft, suiting both manual and automatic vehicles. If you're not sure which version you have, you can measure the diameter of the idler shaft at the back of the transfer case with a caliper. Unlike some other transfer cases, the split case should be assembled on the back of the transmission as an integrated unit, so the rebuild usually involves removal of the transmission from the vehicle. In most cases, the parts required to rebuild the T-case are limited to bearings, seals, gaskets, a new idler shaft, and other small parts. Unless something bad happened, you will not need to replace the gears unless you wish to change your gear ratios. Rebuild kits are readily available with everything you will need to get the job done. The Terrain Tamer kits that George sells are complete with Koyo bearings, Japanese seals, and a fresh idler shaft along with gaskets and other loose parts. The kits come in two versions to suit early and late models of the split case, and if you buy from George, he'll stand by to help you make sure you get things put together the right way. George and his partners at Cruiser Brothers is a national importer and distributor of Terrain Tamer repair kits and parts. With Japanese bearings and seals, Terrain Tamer kits present high-quality solutions with pricing that delivers great value, plus George's support. Terrain Tamer kits are available online and through George's partner shops and resellers. These partner shops are also a great place to have your transfer case rebuilt if you decide not to try it yourself. As a Land Cruiser specialist, George and Valley Hybrids know everything you need to know about Toyota transmissions, transfer cases, engine swaps, maintenance, and rebuilds. Not too long ago, our friend owner Esterer decided he needed to take a little road trip and hook up with George to get his transmission rebuilt and his transfer case redone. George said yes, and owner got in his rig to take a trip. Before long, owner was on the road from Covington, Georgia to Stockton, California. What follows is George working on owner's transfer case with owner running the camera.
Rolling.
We're now ready to install the front case half onto the back of the transmission. Again, you're going to need a gasket, which is supplied in the kit. And just as before, I'd like to mark the surface to know where I need to apply sealer. In this case, there's only a couple of little spots where you have to worry about it. Put your gasket on, double check to make sure you have good coverage everywhere, and apply sealer on the mating surface again. Then some sealer on the bolts. Double check, make sure your surface is nice and clean. Your fifth gear oil funnel is installed. Stake nuts tight, bearings seated all the way. Everything turns smoothly. Ready to install. Grab your case half, slide it on. The bearing will hit first, then take a look through, make sure your fifth gear oiler goes into the counter shaft. Pretty straightforward. Double check, make sure everything's perpendicular or parallel. Feels great. Now we're ready to work on the front part and finish this part of the case half. Go from there. At this point, we're going to work on our 2/4 shift rail assembly. This particular transfer case has a vacuum shift pod, so we have to bolt an adapter housing onto the front case half. double check by hand. Make sure everything's tight. Okay, then grab your vacuum shift rail and the slider. Installs from the back of the case. Your pivot pin and your belt crank. And then we need to install the vacuum pod itself. This particular gasket is only available from Toyota. I've never seen it included in any of the rebuild kits. So make sure that if you have a vacuum shift pod, that you order the gasket separate from Toyota. A lot of Land Cruiser shops do keep them in stock. Otherwise, they're readily available. I believe they're less than $3. Check your vacuum pod, make sure that the diaphragm is down on the bottom. Slide it on. I always make sure to start all my bolts before I tighten any of them up. If you tighten the first bolt up before the other ones are in there, you might get the gasket crooked or something might not line up and you might have to take it apart again. Take a look to make sure all the mating surfaces look good, and then check by hand. There you go, shift pod's complete. Okay, we're now going to start the gear install portion of the split transfer case. First thing we need to do is put a bearing race into the front bearing retainer here. So grab the bigger of the two bearings for the output shaft. Then, once again, I like to use a little bit of assembly lube or oil to help this guy slide in place. Otherwise, with the aluminum, especially once it's been bead blasted, it's pretty coarse and they can gall themselves up. This will help it slip in place. Make sure that you align these two ears to end up in this slot right here. Get it started. Good visual. Sometimes you can press them in by hand. A gentle tap with the hammer usually gets them in. Again, make sure your ears are between these two little out castings. Should be able to wiggle it a little bit. That's perfectly normal. Next thing we need to do is install our idler shaft. On the Terrain Tamer idler shafts, unlike some of the aftermarket shafts we've seen, you always see a TT stamped in there. Pretty common. They do that on some of their components to mark them as theirs. You'll need your O-rings. Only install the rear O-ring at first, which actually is in the front case half. Then, once again, I like to put a little bit of silicone, in this case factory FIPG, onto any seal or rubber component, including O-rings. It helps them slip in place and helps it to seal up. The one thing you have to be careful with on the idler shaft is that obviously it has a flat spot machined into it or ground into it for the little retainer, so the shaft can't slide out of the back of the case. If you look at the rear case half, you'll notice that the bolt itself and the retainer line up right between these two bolt holes. So you can slide your shaft in, take a quick visual, point it right between the two, and press it in, and you should be all set. Then install your first thrust washer. Make sure that the little divot in here lines up with the cutout in the case. Otherwise the washer will be held away from the case and will then spin once the gear set turns, but it will gall up the case and the gear set will be super firm. So once the case is assembled, if you can't turn the output easily by hand, you know you have a clearance problem. Most likely it's a thrust washer. One thing that does help is to take a little bit of assembly lube, put it on the back side of the washer, which will somewhat hold it against the case half and keeps it from popping off. Then take your first idler shaft bearing, spacer, second bearing, and then the rear or outer O-ring. The next thing you do is reinstall the slinger on the idler gear. We took this off during disassembly because a lot of times, just like in this case, a lot of fine metal particles get trapped behind the slinger. You definitely want to clean as much of that out as you can to avoid contaminating the fresh transfer case. Make sure you Loctite these. If one of these comes out, the slinger itself will get wedged between the gears and chances are it'll ruin the transfer case. Again, these are fairly small bolts, so you want to be really careful installing them. Don't snap them with a power tool, just be gentle. Then finish them off by hand. Okay, the next thing I like to do, a little more assembly lube. And then slide your gear on. Make sure it doesn't hit anywhere. And then you can install the thrust washer. Some people glue the thrust washer to the rear case half. I like to install the thrust washer first. I know exactly where the tab needs to line up, and we'll come back to that later, but I like to put the thrust washer on now so I don't damage the O-ring. The thrust washer will sneak past the O-ring. If you glue it onto the rear case half, you run the chance of it being offset a little bit, and then as you install it, it might grab the O-ring and cut it. So I prefer to install it now. To hold it in place, I put some assembly lube on it, so it basically gets glued to the gear. Although the assembly lube dissolves in the gear oil. But this way, when you turn the gear, you can control where the little notch in the gear ends up. Next step is to install your transfer case input gear. This has to be done now. You cannot do it before the idler gear because the slinger will prevent the idler gear from sliding past the input gear. Get it lined up. A little bit of oil on the seal surface to help it slip in place. And very gently bring it in until the teeth mat. Snap it in place. Make sure they line up perfectly flat here. Turn everything. Feels good. Slide on your spacer. And then we're ready to assemble the gear cluster for the transfer case output shaft.
Rolling.
All right, next step, we need to assemble the gear cluster on the transfer case output gear. So you'll need the shaft. I like to wire wheel these guys and knock all the old debris out and polish it off, so I can check the bushings and the threads are all in good shape and everything. The nuts thread right on and you won't have any issues. So chuck it up in a vise with soft jaws. If you don't have soft jaws, wrap a rag around here and make sure you don't grab it on a bearing or a bushing surface. First thing you'll need to do is install the pocket bearing again. The kit does come with an OEM Koyo pocket bearing. Then a little bit of assembly lube and your high-speed gear. Next, you have to install the 2.4 hub. I like putting a little bit of oil on the splines so it slides down easier. It's not uncommon that when you install these that you'll shave some metal chips off the hub. You'll be able to start it by hand, but then you'll have to hammer it down. Oh, we screwed up. Okay, redo. Here we have the transfer case output shaft, which is the next part of our assembly. We need to install both the high-speed and low-speed gear, as well as the 2.4 hub and speedo gear, and a couple other parts. First thing I did is install the pocket bearing. I always grab a rag with some brake clean that pocket out really well, and I wire wheel all the thread or the splines and threads on the shafts, and then use an aluminum seal installer and just knock your pocket bearing in. This one I've already got installed, nice and flush, so it's ready. Next step is to install the high-speed gear, since this is the front of the shaft. So put some oil on here, drop your gear on, turns nice and free, no excessive play, and then the front bearing goes on. Again, you have to be careful because the bearings on the front and rear of the shaft are different size. The front bearing is larger, so you can double check it by installing it in the front retainer. Fits perfect, so we know it's the right bearing. Tap that down. Good enough. Then grab your 2.4 hub, put some oil on the splines, get it started. Should wiggle on by hand a little ways. And tap it down a little bit. Okay. Doesn't have to be all the way down. Grab it out of the vise and put it on your bench. Next, you install your high-low slider. It's unidirectional, doesn't matter. And then a little more oil. And your low-speed gear. Always gently lower these on here. If you get them off to the side a little bit, you can damage the bushing. Then your rear bearing, if you hold the hub, stabilize this. And now take it over to the shop press and press this assembly together the rest of the way. Okay, we now have our transfer case output shaft gear cluster assembled. Everything spins freely, bearing seated all the way, the hub seated all the way. Now it's time to install your snap ring again. Okay, and then what I'd like to do, just to make sure that everything looks good, is to install spacer, speedo gear, a little output shim, washer, and a nut, and that'll keep everything in place. Okay, now you need to grab your shift fork. This controls high, neutral, and low. Put a little drop of oil in here. Make sure it slides into its orifice properly. Okay, we're good there. And grab the assembly, install your fork on the slider, and gently install the gear set. There we go. And just like the idler gear, when these guys are installed, it should be flush. At this point, we can prep the rear case half and get it ready to mate to the front case half. It's time to install our rear case half. But before we do that, we have to install our high, neutral, and low shift lever. So first thing, you need the seal. Then the high-low lever. There's a flat washer that goes on here. Little shift arm. Sometimes you have to tap them on. And then the bolt. I like to install these but not tighten them up all the way, because this lever does need a little up and down movement when you install it. So you just snug it up by finger for now. Okay, case half's ready to go on. Now we need our case half gasket and some more sealer. As you can see, I've applied gasket sealer, the gasket itself, and more gasket sealer on the far side on the case half. Figured you'd see me apply the gasket sealer by now, so might as well handle it. And I've applied to all the bolts Now, next thing we need to do is make sure that everything lines up right before we slip the rear case half on. So you can just turn the output shaft and get your little indent here lined up. If you look at the case, you'll see that the cutout in the case is pretty much aligned with this shift shaft. So you come over here, you look at it, and say, okay, it needs to be roughly there. Leave it there. Again, we have assembly lube on there so that washer will not slip. And apply a little bit of the silicone FIPG to the O-ring. Again, this will help it slip in place and help it seal. Then grab your case half. One last check. Everything looks good. Surfaces are clean. Turn your high, neutral, low lever so it can bypass the fork at first. And go ahead and slide it on. Align your fork. Have to come out just a hair. There we go. Double check, make sure you're in the slot. Sometimes they wiggle right in, sometimes you have to tap them gently with the hammer. What you can do, and check to make sure that your idler shaft is aligned properly so the retainer can grab it and keep it from spinning. And then tap your case half down. Now, what you want to do is turn this a little bit. If it turns freely, then we can assume that the washer and the little tab for it is locked in position. What I do is I look in from the side with a flashlight. You can just see the washer and see if the washer turns a little tiny bit until that indentation catches on the case and then goes the other way a small amount also. Yep, looks good. Now take a couple of these bolts, get these started. I like to just try with 2 bolts first. Grab your flashlight again, double check. Looks good. Okay, now that we know we have our thrust washer on properly, everything turns freely, we can install the rest of our bolts. Make sure that you get the 2 wire retainers put back on the case also, since these will hold the switch wiring in place. You'll notice that when I install these, I go really slow at first to make sure I'm not cross-threading them. Realistically, it's safer to do this by hand. If you've done enough of them, you should be comfortable doing it this way too. And then there are 3 shorter bolts. We had a series of 8 longer bolts, 3 shorties. And the last bolt with the wire retainer. These retainers are here to hold the wiring for the switches out of the shift linkage on both the front and the rear. Okay, then we have 3 long bolts. These are the longest ones. They go all the way through the rear case half, the front case half, the 5th gear extension housing, and then thread into the transmission main case. So they sandwich everything together. Snug down the 14s. Double check. And you're done with the rear case half for now. One of the first things I'd like to do after getting the rear case half on is finish tightening down my little shifter. I know it moves freely at this point, so put a 12 mil on there, tighten it up, and install your D10. Doesn't hurt to put a drop of oil in there so it moves freely. D10 ball, spring, and the cup. I put some silicone on the threads from the factory. There is sealer on there also. Since your case half is now finally assembled, the first thing we want to do is make sure we tighten up the high, neutral, low lever. Then you can install the D10 setup for it. Drop of oil in here. D10 ball, spring, then apply a little bit of silicone to the threads of the cup. These have sealer on them from the factory also, and install. Then your retainer for the idler shaft and the proper bolt. It happens to have a built-in flat washer. It's fairly large, different than anywhere else on the combo, so they're easy to identify. Again, put a little bit of thread lock with thread sealer on there. It's essential that this is tight and retained well. If this bolt falls out, the idler shaft can back out, and then you can pretty much retire that transfer case. Okay, now the rear support bearing. This is still the transmission main shaft, which is now sticking all the way through the transmission, the 5th gear housing, the front case half, the rear case half. It needs to be supported in the rear by one of these coil bearings. Gently tap it in. Gets a washer, and then a big 36mm nut. I like to tap these in a little ways before I start tightening up the nut. By hand. Doesn't want to go. Once you have the nut tight, turn everything one more time. I always like to check every item I install. As soon as I'm done with it, I always turn the gear set to feel and make sure there's no obstructions or it's not binding up or too tight. And since it's a stake nut, stake both sides. I've already installed the gasket with some gasket sealer on the rear cover and on these bolts. Line it up. There is a little oil drain back hole, and you can see the indentation on the cover. So whatever oil is captured here drains back through the case. And gently run these down. It's a cork gasket, so you don't want to over torque it or the gasket will split. I use a little electric impact driver just to save time. And then gently torque these down. As soon as you see the gasket squishing a little bit, you know it's tight enough. Double check it. And that's done. Next item we'll get to is the rear extension housing, which is also the Speedo housing. The rear extension housing not only houses a Speedo and covers up the back of the case, but it also sets the preload on the main shaft bearings. And if you recall, when we took it apart, there was a shim in here. So I like to start by putting the same shim back in there, putting the bearing brace in, then I install the gasket without sealer because we need it for thickness to see if our preload's correct. Then I install the extension housing with just 2 bolts. Up. You'll notice I don't have a seal in here yet either. Grab your rear transfer case flange, slide it on, turn it, and you should have some preload. And go ahead and snug this up. Check it. I've got good preload. There's absolutely no play in the flange, and it turns nice and smooth. When you've built a few of these, you know how much preload to expect or what you'd like to see. If you're a novice at it, then obviously you want to use a fish scale and see what kind of preload you have. But this feels fine, so we're going to disassembly again, put our gasket in and our Speedo seal, and go for final assembly. The other item we need to install at this point is our oil funnel, which catches oil being slung around a transfer case, then pumps it past the speedo gear and it'll wash through the bearing. Again, the little retainer bolt, a little bit of Loctite or thread sealer, doesn't take much. Put your gasket aside for a minute and install your rear seal. The easiest way to install a rear seal, and you should have one of these if you own a Land Cruiser, is a 54mm hub socket. The rear seal fits in here perfect, so you can use it as a seal driver. Small amount of FIPG. Tap your seal down. I like to rotate the socket, make sure it sits evenly. Wipe off the excess. Then after you drive a seal in, always double check and make sure the little spring that actually tightens up the seal is still in there. Now you can apply your gasket sealer. Put your gasket on. Some more sealer. A little bit of sealer on the bolts. These are through passages, so on these bolts I apply a little more. Otherwise, the oil can creep through these holes that go all the way through and go along the threads and end up leaking out of the rear of the bolt. The same holds true for the PTO cover. A few of those bolts are through passages as well, so you want to make sure to put a little extra sealer on them so you don't end up with a small leak. I like to apply the sealer all the way around to ensure proper seal. Otherwise, especially if you tighten them up with an air tool, just have it on there and hit it with the air tool, the bolt spins so fast that the sealer just goes flying off and it doesn't do its job. Okay, make sure you line up your speedo properly, double check, make sure you have your spacer, your speedo gear, and your thrust shim. We have our bearing race, little oil funnel, rear seal's in, gasket is on, we're good to go. Note that there's a little extra outcasting on the case here, and there's a little nub here that pretty much helps you get them aligned. And we know for a fact that the speedo points down somewhat just below the fill plug. And once again, check it, make sure everything turns. There we go, feels good. And now it's time to install our Speedo setup. For your Speedo assembly, I like pressing the little hat seal into the Speedo bullet with a socket. You find a socket that just fits in here. Grab your seal, slide it in here, push on with your socket gently, and then just put it in a vise. And you'll feel it go in about a 1/4 inch, maybe a little more, and then stop. Don't overpower it. You can't force the seal too far in. There you go. Take your Speedo gear itself, apply a little drop of oil. Twist it as you're pushing in. You'll see that there's about a 1/4 inch gap. That's where it's starting to make contact with the seal, and then push and it'll snap in place like that. Turn it, nice and smooth. Put your Speedo O-ring on. You can roll it on from the front. That way it doesn't get cut by these threads. I like to smush it around once to make sure it's not twisted. Otherwise it cuts easier. Again, a little bit of FIPG on the O-ring. Look for the tab where it locks in. Line that up. And this you should be able to press in by hand. It'll come to a stop when you hit the O-ring. Just push with your fingers and it'll pop in. Again, before you bolt it down, turn it. And you should be able to watch the Speedo gear turn. Yep, looks good. Then put your little retainer on. And a 12mm bolt. And your Speedo is pretty much done. Now we can install the rear flange. I like doing the flange last, that way it's easier to get to the Speedo and everything else. You'll see that we blasted and painted these flanges. One thing I like to make sure is that there's no excessive paint on the flange, as there is right here. That can wear out a seal prematurely. So clean up the surface real good. Then, again, I use some FIPG on the splines. You might have noticed when you took the transfer case apart that every once in a while you'll see oil in here. And it's actually creeping along the splines and getting behind the washer and then leaking out. Sometimes you'll even notice when you unbolt the drive shaft that a bunch of oil comes out that gets captured in this cavity. But the drive shaft flange is such a good fit that it won't let it leak out. So putting some FIPG on the splines will prevent that from happening. Doesn't take a whole lot. I also like to line up my stake nut so the studs don't get in the way. In this case, I know I have to stake it right here, so I try to go about 90 degrees offset. A little drop of oil. Slides right on. I can get to my stake nut. want those fairly tight. Turn them one more time. Everything feels good. Stake your nut. Other side. That's good. Next we need to do the PTO cover. I've already installed my gasket and put some gasket sealer on the threads. Again, just like the rear cover and the extension housing, as I mentioned earlier, these bolt holes, some of them go all the way into the case, so there's oil that can leak through. So seal these bolts up properly. Finish tightening up by hand. Always try to go in a crisscross pattern to get even torque. At this point, the only thing we have left to do are the electrical switches and the front output flange, and we should be pretty much set. We can now take care of the finishing touches on our transmission. We really only have a couple of accessories left. We'll start with the front output flange. Once again, make sure that the seal surface is clean. If there's any residual paint or anything, make sure you clean it up with some brake clean. Then take a small amount of silicone and seal your splines. Then check to make sure that your front drive is engaged. If not, you can either apply vacuum or air pressure to switch the diaphragm so the front's engaged and doesn't spin freely on you. A little bit of oil on the flange. On the outside, where the seal rides obviously is where you want the oil. And slide it on. One thing you have to be careful with when you install these flanges is that the flanges are slightly different for the front and back. If you look at it really closely, you'll see that this flange has a smaller slinger on it than the front. If you install this flange on the front, it'll bind up on the case, and then when you try to tighten up the nut, it'll smash this oil or this dirt shield or slinger. Tighten this up. It's also a good idea not to reach in here and hold onto this flange when you're tightening this up, or you'll pinch your hand. So, since we're in four-wheel drive, you can just grab the rear flange, hang on to it. Take a drift and stake your nut. Opposite side, and your front output is finished. You can now install your pivot bolt again. I like to wait on this until I have the flange installed so you have more room to get in here. You can put a little bit of Loctite on here or thread sealer. It doesn't take much. It's got a lock washer to keep it in place. both ends on and tighten it down. Okay. Next, we need to get to the pressure switches. There are 4 of them total on this combo, 3 of them for the transfer case and 1 for the transmission. The shortest wire is the one for the transmission. Grab a new drain plug gasket. Again, I like to apply just a small amount of silicone to the threads to help seal. And install your switches. This particular switch is used for reverse. So when the reverse shift rail is engaged, it opens a circuit that then fires up your reverse lights. Next, I install the front output. This is your 4-wheel drive indicator light. It's easiest to tell because it has a blue connector and a pink and black wire. Then grab the smaller of the 2 switches left over. These are for your 4-wheel drive solenoids. The smaller one uses a smaller aluminum crush washer. And the very last one. Then route your wires. This one goes on this little wire retainer. And then all 3 of them combined come around this way on the front retainer. Then the last thing we have to do is install our drain plugs. Again, the Terrain Tamer rebuild kit comes with all these crush washers. Always put new crush washers on here. In this case, we've updated the transmission and transfer case to the Allen head 10mm style plugs versus the earlier 24mm version, which gives more trouble rounding off. I also like to install a little bit of silicone when I put these on. On the transfer case itself, the fill plug was stripped, so we opted to tap it out to a 1/2-inch pipe plug, which you don't have to drill it or anything. All you do is take a 1/2-inch pipe, tap it, grab yourself a plug, and that way you don't have to replace the case. So I do my drain plugs or my drain plugs first. Flip your case up. A little bit of silicone. It's not a bad idea to carry a 10mm wrench in your truck, Allen wrench, so you have it in case you need to top off your oil. It's one of the specialty tools you should keep in your cruiser. Rotate it, and then I don't put any silicone on these plugs yet because obviously we still need to add oil. So I just start them in the case, and now your combo is ready to be installed.
Thanks for watching this edition of Shop Talk with George. If you have questions or if you'd like to order parts or kits, give us a call. 800-224-7801 or go to cruiserbrothers.com. Have a great day.